Christensen. We have the privilege of presentation from Mr. Stefano Scarpetta from OECD, who is the Director for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs. He will give a presentation focused on responsible supply chains and gender target.
Thank you. Yes, we spoke. Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure for me to participate in the C20 Summit and briefly report to you some of the discussion we are having in the Employer Working Group leading to the G20 Labor Ministry and then of course the G20 Leaders Summit. Indeed, I would like to say a few words about the progress in moving towards the goal of 25 by 25, that is reducing the gap in labor force participation between men and women by 25% by 2025, but also say something of the important work the Employer Working Group is doing also on responsible business conduct. So on the first point, as you all know, this is situation 2018. The blue bar are the employment, the labor force participation rate of women, and the little dot in orange is actually the labor force participation of men in the G20 countries. And you can see that even in 2018 there are significant gaps in the participation rate between men and women. In some of the countries on the right hand side this gap is very sizable. This is basically the foundation why in 2014 in Brisbane the leaders agree on this common goal of reducing the gender gap by 25% by 2025. Now, how much progress has been made? In this chart, you have the blue, which is basically the changes that has taken place from 2012, when we started the analysis of the evolution in labor force participation, and the little dot is what we could have expected if there was a linear progression towards the target of 25 by 25. The good news is that if you look at some countries, the little dot is well within the bar, which means that the countries have done more than what it was expected in order to achieve the target by 25. Notably, if you look at a country like Japan, where we are, in order to achieve a 25%, the 2.3 percentage point reduction was expected by now, by 2018. In fact, in Japan, there has been a reduction in the gap by 6 percentage points, much more. And you can see that there are a number of other countries in which, again, there has been more progress than what we could have expected. So they are very well placed in order to achieve the target, if not to go beyond. It goes without saying that in Japan, this very important achievement has been obtained because of a very strong focus of a number of policies and a strong engagement with different stakeholders in trying to promote the further participation of women to the labor market. Of course, you see a number of countries in which not only the objective was very ambitious, but actually progress has been pretty limited. So there is a variation of situation across the G20 countries in terms of progress made and what could be expected going forward in order to achieve the target that was agreed upon in 2014. I think in the G20 and in the Employment Working Group and the Minister of Labour, we have gone way beyond looking just at participation of women to the labour market. A lot of the focus has also been on how to improve the quality of jobs that women have when they do participate into the labour market. And I think, as you will see in a second there, progress has been somewhat more subtle. So if you look at the pay gap, here you have the gap for men and women. And you see the situation in 2017 of the latest for which we have the data, and the little orange is actually the situation in 2026. So the first point to notice here is that there's been some progress, but as you can see, the dot and the diamond are actually very close to one another, meaning that the progress has been very small. And you can see that in some countries, the pay gap is actually extremely sizable, is in the order of 35% in some countries, 20% in others, and only in a very few countries is in the range of 10 percentage points. So large and persistent gap in pay. The second point is that still, when we look at working time, part-time work is largely dominated by women. Here you see that the gap is in the opposite direction, of course. There are many more women actually working only part-time, and a number of them are doing that because either they cannot find a full-time job or they cannot afford to work full-time because of other responsibilities they have to take care of. So again, as an element of greater participation to the labor market, is also absolutely needed to a better share of time at work and outside work between the men and the women, and this has been very much the focus of our discussion also in the employment working group that is going on at the moment. The third point is also that when we look at how women participate into the labor market, and we look at how many women are in managerial positions, again, here you see the very substantial gap in the share of women in managerial position compared to men. The gap is almost 40% percentage point in some countries. It goes down to 15 percentage point only in few countries. Again, you see the situation in 2012 and 2018, some progress, but very modest progress. So again, another element in which progress has been there, but in many countries has been fairly limited. And the last point is also that greater participation of women means also more women participation as self-employed, as entrepreneurs. And here again, you see the gap in 2012 and 2018, which is very large in the employment share of self-employed women. So fewer women participate in the labor market self-employed, they actually are entrepreneurs and they entrepreneurial activity by themselves. So this is to give you a very quick snapshot. I know that you have a very busy agenda on some of the progress that countries, G20 countries have made on promoting gender equality, not only in terms of participation, but I think the focus has to be much more on job quality, full participation, pay, but also other key element of working condition. If I have a few more minutes, I would like just to say a few words about another important objective that the G20 countries have agreed upon. That was in 2017 when in Germany, in Baden-Württemberg, the Minister of Labor agreed to foster responsible business conduct throughout the supply chain. It goes without saying, and I'm sure you have discussed that supply chain now are pervasive. Most countries developing emerging advanced economies are participating in the global supply chain. Trade has increased by 30% only in the past year. Let me just read what was one of the key passages in the declaration of the Ministry of Labor. They said, we will work towards establishing policy frameworks in our countries to support the attainment of decent work and strengthen compliance with fundamental principles and rights of work in global supply chain. Now, ensuring a positive contribution by business to sustainable development while allowing negative impact is a key component of actually making progress, promoting productivity, economic growth, but actually most important, a sustainable process of economic growth and the respect of labor rights. This goes just beyond the companies respecting the law, but actually being active players in terms of promoting quality of jobs, decent work, and actually fundamentally the respect of labor rights. This is not just something that only large multinational companies have to make progress on, but actually it's an area in which progress has to be made throughout the supply chain, including all possible components. Now, how much progress have we made? Some, but not too much, I would say. Across the G20 countries, a number of them have developed programs or regulation to enable responsible supply chains. Around 20 countries, G20 and non-G20 countries, all of them actually are adherent of the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises, have adopted national action plans on business and human rights, as also called in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. For example, the National Action Plan in Germany contains explicit reference to the expectation that companies identify and address the human rights issues in their supply chain, and a few countries have adopted new legislation on company responsibility throughout the supply chain. I'd like to conclude by giving you just a few examples of some of these measures that have been taken. As you probably know, the UK Modern Slavery Act in 2015 requires companies operating in the UK to disclose action or the absence thereof to identify and address risks of forced labor in their supply chain. The US Trade Facilitation Enforcement Act in 2015 prohibits all products made by forced labor, including child labor, from being imported into the United States and require annual reporting by companies. In France, the 2017 duty of the vigilance law, or the Guardia Relative ou Devoir de Vigilance, requires large companies to elaborate, publish, and implement a plan to identify and address human rights and environmental risks in their supply chain. In Australia, in 2018, entered into force in 2019 as a new Modern Slavery Act that requires again embedded due diligence into public procurement. And last but certainly not least, in the European Union, there are a number of instruments that touch upon the supply chain due diligence, on the Non-Financial Information Disclosure Directive, the regulation of import of minerals from conflict-affected and high-risk areas, and the provision of responsible management of supply chain, which are included in some of the most recent EU free trade agreements. So some action has been taking place in the G20 countries, but I think much more is needed in using, actually, if I am allowed to say, some of the international instruments which are available, including the OECD Multinational Enterprise Guideline, including the guidance on due diligence, which are being set up by the OECD in 2018, but actually there are also a number of guidance for specific sectors. Let me conclude with that. There are, in a number of key sectors, minerals, extractive, garment, and footwear, agriculture, and financial sector, specific guidance on to promote due diligence at the company level. I think much more progress with a good cooperation between government and the company themselves is needed in order to really foster responsible business conduct and the better improvement and enhancement of due diligence procedures within the companies. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention and for your time you have given to me. Thank you.
It's always quite shocking to see where Japan stands with the gender gaps, but thank you so much for adding richness to our discussions. Once again, please, big hands to Mr. Stefano. Thank you.
Hello everyone. I'd like to start this session by introducing a paragraph or message from a recent report of ECOIC, which is an independent commission for a reform of international taxation, of which such renowned economists as Professor Joseph Stiglitz and Professor Thomas Piketty are the commissioner. It says, inequality is a result of the institutions and the policies that we adopt as a society. If inequality is a result of our actions, then we can restructure our economy to restore more equitable conditions for all. This can only happen when such actions are driven by inclusive institutions and policies, including progressive taxation of income and wealth. Our invited speaker contributed greatly to the establishment of this commission. Some of you might have heard about base erosion profit shifting program, usually called BEPS program, adopted by OECD and G20. Many of the policies currently being undertaken by many countries in the world under this program were originally the idea proposed by our invited speaker. His name is John Christensen. Mr. John Christensen is an economist and a trained forensic auditor. He is currently the chair of Board of Directors of Tax Justice Network, which he co-founded in 2003. He is a former economic advisor to the government of Jersey. He is currently a board member of Tax Inspectors Without Borders, which is the joint initiative by OECD and UNDP, and also a member of a Parliamentary Economic Advisory Group in the United Kingdom. So let's welcome Mr. John Christensen.
Thank you, Ayuba. Thank you to the organizers of this event. It's an honor and a privilege and quite a bit of fun to talk today. I've been asked to talk about our work on tackling tax havens and why this is so mission critical to the work of the G20. Why, if we are to address issues like inequality and erosion of democracy, we must tackle these places. But and I'm going to talk a bit about what I refer to as the tax termites, the role of tax havens in undermining, secretly, carefully undermining all the structures of modern society and democracy. Hence, I talk about termites, I'll talk about that at some length. But Ayoba has asked me to begin with a little bit of talk about my personal journey. On Sunday, one of the speakers talked about when she first went into working for an NGO, how her friends felt that this was NGOs are slightly amateurish. That's not my impression at all. The people I work with in the NGO community are amongst the most professional people I've ever worked with, and I've worked in the private sector where I've trained, and in the government sector. I was a senior government economic service person. I ran a government department for 7 years. But a few years ago, to celebrate our success with G20, a very famous investigative journalist gave me a pack of cards with this printed on it. This comes from another journalist, Hunter Thompson, who said, when the going gets weird, the weird turn professional or turn pro. And I think that's exactly what we set out to do, and I set out to do, when we took on the issue of tackling tax havens and their role in the global economy. My story begins in November 1978, at which time I was training in forensic audit and forensic investigation in London, but I was also working as a volunteer for Oxfam in a rather unusual part of Oxfam, which was looking at the systemic causes of poverty, and we were looking at capital flights, illicit financial flows, and the inability of many of the poorer countries to mobilize domestic resource. 1978, so quite a long time ago. And I was particularly influenced, and I want to pay tribute to an economist from the London School of Economics who most of you might not have heard of, called Professor Susan Strange. For those of you who haven't heard of Professor Strange, she did remarkable work looking at the international financial architecture. Her two most famous books, as far as I'm concerned, were one called Casino Capitalism, the other was called State and Markets. And in those books, she explored the systemic risks within the financial architecture. And she said to me in November 1978, we need to understand where tax havens fit into the modern economy. No one is studying this systemically. And I knew then that I had a career for life. And that's exactly what I went on to do. In order to understand how tax havens harm development, and you can't learn about this in university, I could only go one route, and that's to go offshore and work within offshore financial services and work in the heart of the tax havens, and that's precisely what I did. I finished my studies, got on my motorbike, headed south to my home island of Jersey. I originate from Jersey, and worked for a global accounting firm called Keynote for several years. And then, to my surprise, I was recruited to head the government economic service of Jersey, not what I was expecting, and therefore had an almost unique insight into not only how Jersey interacted with UK government, but also with the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank, and most of the other international organizations. And that made me uniquely placed in many respects to take on the task of creating a global tax justice movement. And I'll tell you a bit more about that. But I also want to talk a little bit about the journalist I worked with. The journalist who gave me that pack of cards, Nicholas Jackson, went on to produce this book, Treasure Islands, which I know is translated from Japanese, so I recommend it to any Japanese-speaking people here or reading people here. This book has had remarkable political salience. For those of you who think that maybe politicians don't read any longer and that writing books is not enormously helpful, I dare to contradict, because this book was sent as a present by one of the leading G20 finance ministers to every finance minister in every G20 country, in fact to every finance minister across the world. And in 2012 led to the remarkable successes of our network, translated into, for example, the adoption by G20 of country-by-country reporting, a standard that we developed, and indeed we wrote the original draft for it. It led on to the adoption of automatic information exchange of tax information between national authorities, and only the year before it was adopted in 2012, I was told by the OECD, this will never be adopted by the G20, and as a result of civil society pressure, it was adopted that year. And it led also to the strong pressure, and this is still a work in progress, for the OECD for the G20 to implement public registries of beneficial ownership and to make those registries of companies and trusts and foundations available to civil society, in fact to anybody across the world through public access. And this is why a very idealistic young anti-poverty campaigner working in 1978 in London came to head an organisation which, according to this article and the Financial Times, has been a battle with the OECD and G20 for many years. Quite the opposite, I actually have very good relations with the OECD, but nonetheless, we have been pushing most strongly for the complete transformation of the international architecture when it comes to taxing multinational companies and to tackling tax havens. In 2002, I was asked or commissioned to create a global tax movement, a tax justice movement. It's pretty much in place. It's a movement in three parts. It's a movement, the Tax Justice Network itself is a professional research network. We operate in 80 countries across 6 continents. By and large, we provide professional advisory services and support advocacy work. But alongside us is a remarkable network many of you will not have heard of. You can visit their website, Finance Uncovered, in order to achieve effective advocacy around this subject. We have to work with investigative journalists. You will know of some of our work. You will have heard of LuxLeaks. You'll have heard of Panama Papers. You'll have heard of Paradise Papers. You'll have heard of Swiss Leaks. We worked in all of these areas, and we worked with the investigative journalists to put this, to help them, A, understand the issues, and secondly, communicate the issues on our behalf. And the third part of our global network movement is the campaigning and advocacy side organised by civil society NGOs in many countries around the world. So that was the ecosystem that I designed and I put into place along with my colleagues over the last 12 years. And I think that's what led, the fact that we were very professionally driven, it led to our successes quite early on in our campaigns with G20. For those of you who don't read French, this is a French newspaper, April 2009, ahead of the G20 in London. The headline reads, "They want to put an end to tax havens." And that was the G20 commitment at the height of the financial crisis. As I've said in the strapline here, we have some unfinished business, and that's what I want to talk about today. Because I think G20 needs to go further and needs to be more ambitious. As a starting point, just to get a sense of where I'm coming from, my vision, I'm deeply critical of the Washington consensus, trade liberalization, capital account liberalization, the tax cuts and tax wars and tax competition, not so much because I'm ideologically opposed to them, but more because it's been very, very badly done, above all in the case of financial market liberalisation. At the time it was started in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, many economists, including myself, were warning governments, if you do this without having the correct framework of rules in place, you will create a criminogenic environment which helps tax evasion, helps tax avoidance, facilitates massive capital flights and illicit financial flows. You will create a criminogenic global environment. They were warned at the time, and they ignored us. And the situation has got progressively worse, and they are still not taking adequate measures to kick back against this. I would posit a very different consensus, again, as an alternative to the Washington consensus, the tax justice consensus, which we developed from 2003 onwards. If takes as our focus, if we want to achieve the goal of domestic resource mobilization and inequality, we must have a proper framework of rules and regulations to tackle the issues of tax havens and to tackle the problems arising from tax avoidance. We also need to have enhanced transparency to tackle illicit flows, and that includes transparency of corporate accounting, ownership disclosure, transparent tax rules and procedures. And we also need very urgently, and this is now a work in progress for G20, we need to make sure that the taxing rights of big multinational company profits are aligned with economic substance and apportioned accordingly, and that developing countries are not systematically and purposefully excluded. Their interests are not excluded from the discussions that are going to be taking place in the next couple of years around revising the base erosion and profit shifting process. Now, many people like to share pictures of cats and dogs on Instagram. Here's a picture of a termite. I've chosen a termite because termites operate very secretively. They undermine the structures and structural integrity of buildings by eating the wood from inside. And I'm going to argue that tax havens have been doing precisely that for many decades. They operate in three key areas. First of all, they facilitate trade-related tax avoidance, the so-called base erosion and profit shifting, which reduces public revenue and leads to misallocation of investment. Secondly, they facilitate illicit financial flows and associated tax evasion, which not only harms domestic resource mobilization, it also reduces confidence in democracy itself and in institutional quality. What do I mean by institutional quality? I mean that our judicial systems, we all know that there are set different rules for rich people and for powerful corporations, and that our judicial systems treat them separately. And this harms our confidence, certainly harms my confidence, in the institutional quality of democracy. We also know, and I think G20 countries have yet to address this issue, that as a result of capital mobility, not labour mobility, but capital mobility, capital can move around the world, it can exert through its own political power, it can exert influence over political processes to achieve tax exemptions. They deliberately set out to encourage tax competition, which I don't even recognise as an economist. I don't recognise that term tax competition. I recognise the term tax wars. It encourages economic rent seeking and it distorts market competition. And I don't believe that G20 has even begun to address these issues. So let's start with the tax avoidance issue. IMF calculates, or their estimates suggest that over $700 billion a year is lost to just this one area, that is base erosion and profit shifting by multinational companies. Our calculations come up more or less in the same ballpark. This is macroeconomic significance. It is particularly harmful to developing countries. For those of you who attended the session yesterday, you're familiar with this example. Until we, civil society, started to take on this issue, what I heard from IMF and from OECD and from G20 time and time again was, John, the issue of tax avoidance is not systemic, it's just a few rotten apples. I'm sure you've heard the same thing. We argue differently, it's systemic. And we led campaigns or other investigations, working with investigative journalists, to not only investigate Starbucks, Caterpillar, Apple, Amazon, Google, and a whole host of others. We also did a major investigation of Big Banana. And the reason I chose banana is because, again, I think I was hearing from politicians, oh, well, all this tax avoidance is a problem of the digital economy. Amazon's a big digital player. The profits are all being made up there somewhere in a cloud, because I bet our politicians don't understand digital economy at all. And I said, no, it's systemic. The rules are flawed. The rules are deliberately flawed. The rules are created by the OECD to meet the interests of the OECD. We have a systemic failure. Let me talk you through the nature of this systemic failure with the example of bananas. So this article was published in the Guardian newspaper. It was the first major investigation of transfer pricing failures. And you can go online. If you go online, use your search engine, you can pick up the article from our website. 3 minutes? Is that correct? Got to move on. Okay. Sorry, I was told that much longer. Right, so I don't think I'll be able to go through this, but if you, this example shows how, in the case of one company, they shifted almost half of the final retail value, the final price of a banana through their supply chains in order to shift value and shift profits to tax havens. The shocking thing about this example, I'm going to have to go on very fast. Sorry, is this right? I've got 3 minutes? No, I'm going to go on. The shocking thing about this example is that actually everything that was done there was perfectly legal within the existing framework of rules set by the OECD. But it goes deeper than that, because we have, people say, is it an issue of lack of legislative clarity in the producer countries? Is it a lack of enforcement capacity? Is it because we're dealing with very aggressive multinational companies and their tax lawyers? Is it because the rules of the game are simply impracticable? Is it because we've got a very very permissive global regime around intellectual property rights? The answer is all of those things apply. We have a systemic problem with our hands. In terms of the tax losses to developing countries and to all countries, it runs to hundreds of billions every year. But the problem gets worse because of the facilitation of illicit financial flows. The story out there is that Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is a net debtor to the rest of the world, despite the fact that sub-Saharan Africa has massive mineral resources. But actually, if you read this book here, Africa's Odious Debts, is an extraordinarily good investigation of this. If you look more deeply at what's happened to Africa's wealth, it has been transferred carefully and systematically offshore, and the sums transferred offshore massively outweigh the external debts of Africa. Look at the figures here. You have illicit outflows between 1970 to 2008 of 944 billion. These are the best estimates that I've come across. Whereas the external debts at the end of 2008 were 177 billion. It is quite clear that Africa is a net creditor to the rest of the world, but Africa's resources have been pillaged and looted, and none of that looting could have happened without secrecy jurisdictions and tax havens. And the important point to note here is that almost all of those secrecy jurisdictions and tax havens are linked to G20 countries and OECD countries. How much personal wealth is held offshore? Well, the best estimates that I have, which I commissioned from a New York agency, research agency that specializes in this, somewhere between 21 trillion to 32 trillion dollars of personal wealth is held by so-called high net wealth individuals offshore. This Economist special, this is a special edition of the Economist magazine, which I worked on with the editorial team. They chose the lower end of our estimate, certainly risen a great deal, but the Economist concluded that we were largely right in our analysis of the systemic problems. Now, it's not just the problem that all this wealth is sitting lodged in offshore companies, largely investing onshore, of course. And it's not just a problem that the wealth has been looted from Africa, the problem is that the African countries are losing massive amount of money that should be invested in their countries and should be generating tax revenues. The tax revenue loss, according to our own figures, if you look at the percentage of public healthcare spending in Africa, it's, the tax losses to tax evasion for Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, are close to 100% of their public health revenues. Sorry, public health expenditures. So we're talking massive sums. Now I want to talk a little bit about my own experience of working offshore in the small island of Jersey, my home island. And I mentioned that I worked for a company called Deloitte. I had the opportunity to work in their offshore trust and company administration division, and in the period of working there, went through investigated well over 120 clients, and this is what the clients were doing: insider trading, market rigging, avoiding disclosure of conflict of interest. Well, you can read for yourself all the different types of criminal activity that were happening offshore as a result of the secrecy that these secrecy jurisdictions provide. Tax evasion and avoidance, of course, was one of the main issues, but fraudulent mispricing, fraudulent invoicing, bribery, avoiding inheritance, and evading taxes, it was systemic. And for that reason, I think that G20 now needs to urgently revise its perceptions of the geography of corruption. Corruption is a global issue, quite clearly, but I want us to look more carefully at the supply side of corruption, at the enablers, the banks, the lawyers, the accounting firms, the whole infrastructure, professional infrastructure that work through tax havens and enable this very high level corruption. In terms of orders of magnitude, bribery of public officials is a minor matter compared to the huge illicit outflows and the huge corruption that is facilitated by the offshore financial services. So, in stark comparison to the Corruption Perceptions Index, our Financial Secrecy Index, I'm not sure how well you can pick it up there, put Switzerland, United States, the Cayman Islands, Hong Kong, Singapore, Luxembourg, Germany, Taiwan, Dubai, and the small Channel Island, British Channel Island, and Guernsey in the top 10. Almost a complete reversal of the Corruption Perceptions Index. Finally, on the tax termite side, we have this whole issue of multinational companies eroding the tax systems of particularly poorer countries by pushing for tax reliefs, tax holidays, engaging in or promoting tax war and so on. In their report on just 3 countries, ActionAid showed that Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal lose close to $6 billion a year as a result of this kind of tax competition, which serves no useful purpose whatsoever. And again, I think the G20 have done nothing whatsoever so far to reverse this. So, I've been told it's time up all the time now, but I'm just going to go through 5 key policy measures which we are pushing G20 now in what I regard as our second phase of pushing G20 to tackle the tax haven issue. First of all, I want them to finally require all jurisdictions across the world to make their company registries and their trust registries and their foundation registries available so we have information about beneficial ownership on public record, which means that investigators like me can have access to this. Secondly, we think it's time that all parliaments started to scrutinise the huge tax exemptions given to companies, the tax reliefs, the tax holidays. In most of the cases, these tax reliefs serve no useful economic purpose whatsoever, and we think that these reliefs should be subjected to annual cost-benefit analysis. Thirdly, in order to help the tax authorities of all countries, not just developing countries, we want the G20 to instruct the OECD to develop and adopt an international financial reporting standard on good practice on tax reporting by multinational companies. I've discussed this with the OECD last week, and they are very interested. They recognise the need for this, and it ties in with my work with the tax inspectors without borders. Fourthly, we want the OECD to prepare international guidelines for apportioning corporate profits on the basis of sales and other factors of economic substance, and importantly, to agree a minimum corporate income tax rate to underpin the corporate income tax regimes across the world. In other words, it's time to put an end to these outrageous, politically and economically outrageous tax wars that we're seeing around the world and which are accelerating at the moment. And finally, as you heard earlier, I'm on the board of directors of a very interesting project. In fact, I'm the founder of it. I initiated this project called Tax Inspectors Without Borders. And this is the plea to the Japanese government, which has a long and very honourable record of helping developing countries to strengthen their tax capacity, to build tax capacity within their tax authorities. We want to help less developed countries to tackle corporate tax avoidance and evasion. We have created a network of very senior tax inspectors and auditors precisely to do this, and I welcome Japanese government engagement in this new and already very successful Tax Inspectors Without Borders initiative, which is a joint initiative between OECD and the United Nations Development Programme. So there we go. I'll have to skip that. Any of you who want to take a more detailed look at the tax haven issue, I produced this film which was released at the end of 2008. It's available on YouTube, so you can watch it freely. And so it's, to my mind, the first documentary film to really explore the history of the growth of the global tax haven economy. So thank you very much indeed for this opportunity. My time is up. Any questions and comments, you're welcome.
Thank you, I skip my questioning, and I take at least one question from the floor. Yes.
Yes, actually, I would like to say, I have seen the price we pay. In one of the videos, the Senators Committee chairperson asked the representative of Google or Apple, I'm not sure, how many countries you operate. And then they say, the chair asked, in how many countries you have your tax footprint. Then the representative is silent. And he says, we are not doing anything illegal. The chair says, but don't you think what you are doing is immoral? And this is what exactly is doing. The public service is affected, they don't pay the tax, take subsidies, and then the profits are shifted to tax havens. It is not that the governments do not know what to do, but they don't want to do. What is the solution?
I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the golden rule. The golden rule is those who have the gold make the rules. And that's the problem here. the rules for taxing multinational companies, which were put in place during the imperial era, in other words, in 1930, by the League of Nations, and were followed up by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, have always favored what are called the capital exporting countries, in other words, the OECD. And they have put the source countries, that is the countries where the profits are generated, in the south at a major disadvantage. It is not a coincidence that almost all of the world's major tax havens, especially UK and US, are OECD countries, and that they have been setting the rules. Solutions are easy. There's no technical reason why we should not move immediately towards treating companies. And sorry, I was under pressure. I was going to talk at great length about the banana case study, because that was a perfect example of where the rules fail. The current rules allow multinational companies to set up all of these subsidiaries in tax havens and to pretend these are separate entities, taxable elsewhere, in other words, in tax havens where there's no tax. And it allows them to shift the profits. So we have a situation where the profits of multinational companies are totally unaligned with the economic substance of what the multinational companies are doing. The solution is quite simple, and this is what all of the experts and the Independent Commission for Reform of International Corporate Taxation is calling for: a new system which says, let's treat a multinational company not as lots of separate companies set up in tax havens. Ignore those. Look at the economic substance. Where does Google actually make its sales? Where does Amazon actually make its sales? Where do the banana companies actually employ labor to produce the bananas and make their sales? And align profit taxing rights with the profits arising from economic substance. None of that is rocket science. This is just a matter of political will. And that is why G20 has to address it. And of course, India, being a G20 member, can play a part. It was India, by the way, that very successfully in 2012 aligned with us and pushed for the automatic information exchange. It was Prime Minister Singh who did this, and he persuaded G20 at Cape Town in 2012 to do this. So, you know, it boils down to political will. Simple as that.
Thank you very much. Mr. John Christensen is going to the Parliament this afternoon to speak to parliamentarians. He will be available, and he is willing to take a personal question, not about his personal life, but take a question personally. Thank you very much. But before completing this session, I have to make announcement. The session in the afternoon will resume 10 after 1 instead of 10 o'clock. I got this message from the Secretariat. So please give a big hand to Mr. John Christensen. Thank you very much.